Okay, a very good morning to you. For me, this is Jan Brevar. I'm the group security architect at Conscia Group, and we are starting the webinar called Four Things MDR Providers Don't Like Talking About. Basically, I worked as a service owner for MDR at Conscia, and based on the experience of offering MDR services in the market, basically I want to discuss with you or basically present some of the things which we have seen that MDR services today are difficult to compare on, and certain things which typical MDR providers might not like talking about because those services might, for example, be suboptimal in certain cases. And this will allow you to basically compare different MDR providers and choose the MDR service which actually fits your environment best. So just some housekeeping up front. So definitely connect to audio to hear me. You will be muted, but there is a Q&A session or chat which you can use to ask questions. I will tackle questions at the very end, but we basically ask any questions you would like to ask related to the topic of MDR and MDR services. We are basically recording also this webinar, and also we will be sharing this recording afterwards. A couple of things about me. I am a group security architect at Conscia Group. I've been doing digital security for more than 30 years and only this technical. I started doing security in the early 90s by what I call Lego firewalls. At that point, there was no firewall product, and we basically had to build firewalls ourselves using certain building blocks which resembled Lego blocks. And today I'm focusing really on MDR services. Why? Because I feel that MDR today is the strongest tool which we have to combat digital crime. I think that we have arrived at a point when there is so much gray zone activity which cannot be addressed by traditional preventive technology, that MDR is actually the only technology and service combination which can actually address the modern actions of digital criminal actors. I work for Conscia Group. Conscia Group is a pan-European company with presence in a lot of countries. We're a very engineering-oriented company, and our focus is basically to be the market leader in cybersecurity and managed services across Europe. We want to basically secure and simplify technology as it is used in society, but really what we want to do is also protect customers' environments well with a certain set of advanced security services. Okay, that said, let's go right into the meat of today's presentation. So MDR services are defined as basically a new way of running managed remote SOC services. This definition comes from Gartner, and the idea is that MDR services, managed detection and response, provide customers with remotely delivered security operations center services, but in a turnkey experience, which differs quite a bit from the previous experiences of using SOC. So today, modern MDR typically relies on the provider to choose the right technology pack, to choose the right use cases, and to choose the detection framework and the response framework which they will operate with, of course, in some discussion with the customer. But it is no longer the customer typically dictating exactly what needs to be detected, responded on, because this is the expertise of the provider. So I think this is the biggest difference we have seen. And also there is a huge difference, as you will see, in the technology platforms which we use to detect and respond to attacks. So this session is about having basically the knowledge on how to compare different MDR providers and how to address the typical weaknesses in MDR offerings. And I would like to go over 4 different topics, which I think are the most important ones based on what we have seen in the market and also with our customers. So the first topic we'll talk about today is kind of the elephant in the room, which I think is one of the most important issues that MDR providers face today, which is threat visibility. So the question which you typically would ask an MDR provider is, what criminal activity will you be able to detect, and when will you be able to detect that? So this is, I think, a very, very important question, because it relates directly to the amount or to the percentage, so to say, of coverage which a provider will have over a potential criminal's activity in your environment. This basically tells us what will be the quality of the visibility in your environment, and that directly influences basically the speed of detection, of course. So typically we see quite a large spectrum of customer demands and also provider guarantees. Certain customers, for example, have requirements which basically say we need those 10 particular use cases to be detected and responded on, and those are the 10 cases of activities we want to see in the customer environment. Typically, when we see questions like this typically means the customer is coming from a CM environment or with a CM mentality where the number of use cases was very small, and basically the CM was programmed to detect only perhaps the most important or the easiest use cases which are implementable through that technology. On the other end of the spectrum, we have customers basically saying we want to detect everything. Everything is a very strong word, and if we want to detect everything, we can get close to it, but at a very, very high price. So most of the time, MDR providers cannot detect everything, but they actually can detect everything that matters. So if you ask a seasoned MDR engineer what is the best approach, they will typically say we want to detect threat actors, and that is kind of typically the focus which we have. So today's MDR services are very good in detecting criminal activity based on a certain set of use cases, which is typically sized in the hundreds or even 1,000 use cases, which is enabled through today's technology. But we should perhaps never aim to detect everything, because everything basically means that our detection framework will be extremely expensive and unwieldy in terms of operational activities. So in terms of visibility, we typically still rely on the MITRE ATT&CK matrix, which is a good thing because the MITRE ATT&CK matrix is still the accepted catalog of threats which everybody is using to somehow describe what are the expected activities of the threat actors. The important part of the MITRE ATT&CK matrix, I think, is that it not only documents the specific techniques which actors are typically using, but it also describes the typical sequence. So basically the MITRE ATT&CK matrix should not only be read as a catalog, but also as a time-based method, basically attackers starting on the left-hand side with reconnaissance, then moving through the different categories of techniques until they reach the final impact on the right-hand side. This is a very important issue because it also tells us at what point in the attack chain can we detect a particular threat actor. So first of all, it is important to understand, for example, that if we compare the two technologies which are still used in MDR today or predominantly used, which are XDR, so things like Microsoft Defender, Palo Alto Cortex XDR and so on, versus CM, which is, I think, a sunsetting technology, which is migrating more towards log management today, we can see that XDR typically can cover a much larger set of use cases, a much larger set of attacker techniques, but not only a larger set, it can do this much earlier in the chain of the attack. So typically XDR is very strong in detecting initial access, where CM typically is strong only in the later phases of the attack, where the attack has typically also grown beyond, for example, a single infection, a single compromise, and so on, towards the lateration phase. So it's importantly really to actually understand that the time component is really important. So typically a good MDR provider will typically today rely on XDR technology to provide very, very, very fast detection and not wait until, for example, lateration happens in the customer environment. This is really, really critical because we know that typically today we consider 90 minutes as the standard time in which the attackers are likely to progress from initial access to full domain compromise, to the golden keys to your environment. The second thing which is really important is that we need to understand that attackers will use a sequence of actions to go from reconnaissance to impact. They will use what we call a kill chain, so typically 5 or 10 steps before they get to the golden keys or they get to some kind of impact. And it is important to understand that we need to detect only a single step in that sequence to become suspicious or basically to catch the attacker while progressing. So this makes the statistics work in our favor. I always say that it's very easy for the attacker to come in, and we should accept via the assume breach philosophy that attackers will come in. But it is extremely difficult for the attacker to remain undetected for the 5 or 10 steps toward impact, and that basically brings us very close to 100% detection capability today. The fact that we have a lot of coverage, we have early coverage, and that we only have to detect a single step in order to detect the attacker. And finally, I think if we compare XDR and CM technologies today, it is really, I think, very meaningful to consider that for MITRE Ingenuity, which is considered to be, I think, the industry standard test of detection technologies, all the vendors bring XDR technology to the table, but nobody brings a CM anymore. So I think, again, this is a very clear indication that the market has already decided that XDR is definitely the primary technology we use today to detect criminal activities, which CM can be kind of a sidecar to cover the use cases which XDR cannot cover, which is typically a very few percentages of the overall coverage. So in terms of coverage, it is also important to understand what areas of IT are important to cover first. Sometimes we cannot afford or we cannot actually deploy XDR and MDR on top in all the possible areas of our environment. And today it is still true that endpoints, so clients, user systems, mobile devices, servers, are the first battleground. So we definitely have to cover them first because they represent a 75% chance of catching the attackers because they cover the activity there covers about 75% of the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So endpoints are key in our battles. The second thing obviously is the cloud and identity and collaboration based systems. So if you're using things like Office 365, obviously not endpoints are not necessarily required for somebody to attack your cloud. So identity based detections on collaboration based detections, especially email, are basically the second two parts of the holy trinity, which I call basically the main three things which we have to observe today. So endpoints, identities, and collaboration applications. Network is typically a distant fourth because the networks today, while they provide really good mechanisms for attack surface reduction and prevention, networks today cannot provide us with a lot of detection capability. So most of the things that networks in the past were able to tell us is today available through endpoint mechanisms such as EDR. So the network is today not considered, I would say, a prime detection source. It can be added on as the secondary detection source, but in the long run, it will only add a couple of percentage points to the overall picture because of the overlapping of network and endpoint functionality. Now, this is only true in IT environments, right? In OT environments or in IOMT medical environments, things are way different because, of course, we cannot install agents on endpoints. It is hard to actually plug into identity systems and so on. So in OT and IOMT environments, obviously, still the best practice is to do network observation. So we basically do passive observation using typically anomaly-based systems which correlate and build normal profiles of traffic and then alert on any kind of anomalies. This is still currently the best approach. But you have to understand that even with the best approach, we are far from the capability of an IT environment to detect threats. So network is probably the prime or almost the only way that we can actually reliably watch OT and IOMT environments, but that typically gives us about 25% coverage of existing threats. So we are far from the 90+% coverage which we enjoy in IT environments. Another way of looking at this would also be this graph, for example. So in this graph, for example, we can see also how visibility increases based on the technology which we use. So in the old days, when we used CM systems and logs, typically we had visibility between 5 and 20% of the MITRE framework. So pretty low visibility because we saw limited information, limited telemetry, whatever was basically ingested in the CM system. We couldn't really do a lot of contextual telemetry around events. And with the advent of EDR and furthermore XDR, basically the concept of EDR applied to other areas, the visibility has jumped to 75, 85%, 90% of coverage of the MITRE framework. So today, with the simple deployment of XDR technology on a couple of key areas, we can very quickly jump to 90% plus of MITRE coverage, which is excellent, really, compared to the old CM-based designs. And of course, the only problem here is that for all detection technology, it is heavily human dependent. So obviously, we need an MDR provider on top or doing this in-house to actually make any sense of this or any value out of this. And it is really important that you always compare MDR providers and discuss with MDR providers about the visibility they will provide in your environment. So depending on the technology they will use and the areas they will observe. So again, for me, the best practice today is use XDR, first monitor the holy trinity of endpoints, identities, and collaboration. And then if needed, at the end, add a couple of percentage points with additional technologies which could be CM, but again, this should be done in a very cost-effective manner. So moving on, what are the typical problem areas that MDR providers focus today? So if you want to interface with an MDR provider, what is likely to be a kind of a tricky question for the MDR provider or some kind of a tricky thing for you to actually implement. So typically the first problem area which we see is custom applications or SaaS applications other than classic Office 365. MDR providers are very good in basically detecting criminal activity in traditional, general infrastructures, platforms, so things like endpoints, cloud, and so on, which are common across an entire customer base. If you have custom applications or if you have very custom cloud applications, this is typically unlikely to be handled well by the MDR provider Firstly, because custom applications don't provide a lot of telemetry. Secondly, because the MDR provider would have to learn about what is normal in your custom applications. So this is something which typically will become very expensive if the MDR provider will be actually willing to do that. Most MDR providers are not willing to do this for reasons which basically impact their scalability. So this is something which today is not really high on the list of priorities. And if again, honestly, I think it is more important to really focus on the three areas which I mentioned before actually going to monitor custom applications. If you have web applications which are facing the internet, my advice is always invest rather in prevention, in application hardening, in secure programming, than actually in enrolling that application itself in some kind of an MDR or SOC scenario. There is one good, I think, advice as well, is that if you have custom applications or custom SaaS applications, sometimes the authentication layer itself can actually create a strong detection layer around it. For example, if you have single sign-on implemented across your SaaS using Entra ID, observing Entra ID will catch a whole lot of attacks against your SaaS application, even if it's a custom application. So sometimes consider using authentication as the strong layer of detection, which basically acts as kind of an initial access detector around your custom applications. And in this case, every MDR provider can monitor that, and they don't have to know the specifics of your custom applications. Secondly, sometimes vendors are not able to monitor certain aspects of the cloud, namely platform as a service. So we know about infrastructure as a service, which is typically infrastructure delivered by the cloud. We know about SaaS, which is typically things like Office 365. And traditionally, we have really good MDR and XDR technology offers around those areas, around those scopes. Today, a lot of customers are actually using PaaS as well. So platform as a service, so like database as a service, object storage, app services, and so on in Azure, GCP, AWS, and so on. And this traditionally has not been handled well by a lot of XDR tools out there, so we didn't really have good visibility. Today, things are changing for the better. So today, I think we are at the point when for each major cloud platform, we can claim to have quite strong visibility. But I always suggest or guide you towards using the local flavor of XDR of that particular cloud. So if, for example, you're using Azure, the best way to monitor Azure would be Defender for Cloud. If you're using AWS, the best way to monitor that would be AWS Guard Duty. If you're using GCP, the best way to monitor that would be SCC. So this basically ensures that the security technology which is monitoring the cloud is in sync with the cloud features. And you're not likely to run into compatibility issues with third-party monitoring apps not supporting all the features of the cloud. And as we know, PaaS is developer-driven. Developers typically don't want to be limited in their choice of features. So I think the best practice today is go with the native mechanism provided by the cloud, and the MDR provider should be able to monitor the native cloud mechanisms which provide detection capabilities in an XDR fashion, using, for example, those three services I mentioned. The third thing which is really important is that if you deploy MDR with a service provider, you have to ensure that you really have consistent visibility. We have seen in the past quite a lot of cases when we thought we have good visibility, but the customers neglect to tell us about certain parts of their environment where they have not installed agents, they have not connected the right APIs, and so on. So this is really, really important, and typically incidents happen there. Attackers have the uncanny ability to finding those blind spots in your environments. This could be acquisitions, those could be areas which you think are not risky, but they are, and so on. So we call them DFIR targets, so typical targets for large incident response engagements. So my recommendation is here that if you are talking to the MDR provider, see if they also offer some kind of red or purple teaming service, which also allows you to discover your blind spots. Perhaps you don't even know about them, and the provider can use offensive security to further discover your environment and see where the blind spots are, where technology has to be deployed. And the last thing, which is a problem area for MDR, is early reconnaissance. I have seen customers basically saying, can you notify us about every single scan of our website? Our answer typically is no, because you will receive 5,000 alarms each day. I think we have to give up on early reconnaissance detection because there's simply too much of this, and there are very limited use cases in which reconnaissance detection is really useful. So typically, we kind of drop that initial visibility to be able to focus on later steps of the attacker with much higher quality. So the reconnaissance, I think, is not a good idea unless, of course, it is internal reconnaissance. In those cases, of course, internal scans, internal reconnaissance should be alerted on and should, of course, be included in the detection framework. So those are the blind spots or typical problem areas in which you will perhaps discuss with the MDR provider to see how they actually handle it. But sometimes I think you will also have to give in a little bit to, for example, not do certain things. Especially, again, I discourage you from prioritizing custom applications, and I discourage you from prioritizing any kind of external reconnaissance. Okay, so the key takeaways about this section, which I think is the most important one, the one about visibility and with which you can compare MDR providers, because the visibility the MDR provider actually has in your environment will determine the quality of the service, consider if the team is, of course, good. Basically, today we can more or less observe everything, and XDR technology basically allows providers to do this without a lot of in-house development. This is, I think, a big change from the CM-based SOCs of yesterday, when the provider basically had to create a lot of use cases themselves. The second thing is you should always go XDR first. So XDR technology today is definitely the market-leading technology in terms of how we detect things. It comes with thousands of use cases. It basically has focus on the things which criminals are likely to use, and it has that early focus. So it means it is really focused also on the initial access part of the attack chain. Networks, while very good for prevention, they don't bring much value to detection in the IT world, because most of the detection can be done on the endpoint, which was previously done on the network. But networks can be very useful in non-IT environments. But remember, non-IT environments still do not enjoy the overall visibility which we have in the IT environments. We are still much weaker in the OT environments compared to what we can do in IT environments, where we can do more or less everything today. Ensure visibility is consistent. Make sure that you don't have blind spots. You haven't forgotten that new acquisition in terms of observing it. Yeah. And remember, CMs are typically technology which is slowly transitioning to log management. Most of the detection capability that CM provided is today available in XDR. There are probably a few use cases still requiring a CM, but CM, I think, is too expensive in terms of being a detection engine today, and consider basically migrating more towards log management with a more cost-effective solution. Okay, so that was kind of the first area in which you should question the MDR provider and basically challenge the MDR provider to see what kind of visibility they will provide to you using the technology stack which they support. The second thing is extremely important because it signals a shift in customer attitudes towards a more reactive or responsive approach of the MDR providers. So in the past, you typically ask the providers, so what will you be able to detect? So that's the visibility part. But today, I think the primary question will be, what will you be able to disrupt? So this disrupting capability of the vendor is becoming more and more important, and not all MDR vendors offer the same kind of disruption capabilities. So you should be asking about what can be disrupted and when, how quickly. So disruption capability basically is the idea that the vendor is able to focus on the R in MDR, so manage detection and response, to respond as soon as possible to break the chain of events leading to impact. This response is typically in the form of containment. So basically the provider is able to do a fast action which disrupts the attack to contain it and not allow it to proceed towards impact. And this basically, the idea today of a lot of customers is basically saying, better safe than sorry, try to disrupt as much as possible before even talking to us. So they will typically pre-authorize the MDR provider, and the MDR provider should be able to provide those services reliably. Of course, the idea is shortening the time to response. Why is this shortening of time of response important? Because attackers are automating things more and more. Typically, the disruptions that MDR providers should be doing is obviously endpoint isolation. That has been with us for years, of course. So the idea that if there is a compromise of a certain system, the provider should isolate that system or quarantine it immediately to prevent further lateration. Then with the advent of more and more cloud attacks, so we see a shift of criminals to cloud services quite a bit. We are basically doing a lot of identity-based disruptions. So user log off, user disable, those are things which are identity-based and need to be in the portfolio of every single provider. But also they should be done extremely quickly, as we will see. And the last one, you could also demand network blocking either on the firewall, but also on the endpoint. The endpoints perhaps are an even better way of blocking network access to specific sites. An example of that would be if you have seen a new phishing site which has, for example, phished some of your users, you could instruct the rest of your endpoint population not to talk to that site anymore. So a form of dynamic URL filtering. And if you do this on the endpoint, of course, it is better because it's not topology dependent, because the rules will travel with the endpoint and all the mobile users that you have will enjoy the same kind of protection. But in terms of the response speed, it is really important. So this graph, I think, shows very well that the more we delay the response, the larger the cost of our incident response is. So typically today we have to respond sometimes even in seconds or minutes, not hours or days, right? Because the more we delay, the larger the fire will become and the harder the fire will be to put out. So obviously the idea of MDR providers is that they focus on the minutes to hours or even seconds, sometimes, time to respond. And that's kind of the value proposition of MDR. So MDR basically says we will make all incidents very small. And that's what is easiest to accomplish through very fast pre-authorized response. So this is really important. And that kind of guarantees that all of your incidents stay small, that they are easily repairable, that you don't need a large skill set in your IT to address them. But also, again, they will basically, the cost of the incident will remain negligible. So this is, for example, what is the result of this in your IT environment, right? So if we are able to block a particular attacker after he has already or she has already entered our environment in 5 minutes or 10 minutes, then all the customer will have to do is perhaps clean the endpoint, re-image the endpoint, reset the credentials, and so on. So simple IT actions which don't require any significant IR skills. That is kind of the promise of MDR today. So the promise of MDR is that you will never need a large incident response process or activity. You should still have one for contingency purposes, but MDR should keep all your incidents extremely small. That said, even even response in 30 minutes is sometimes not enough. Even response in 10 minutes is sometimes not enough. Attackers have figured out automated ways of actually achieving impact today, which requires us to be even faster. So in traditional phishing, for example, when a user was phished and the password or MFA of that user was captured, the attackers basically took a couple of hours to actually take advantage of the captured credentials to arrive at a certain business email compromise or internal spear phishing attack. So typically phishing today is used to attack Office 365 inboxes. So somebody is phishing your users with a phishing mail, which looks like an invitation to edit something on SharePoint. The MFA credentials are captured in typically an AITM attack, so attacker in the middle attack, and the attacker will then use those credentials to log into the inbox of the user, change the forwarding rules to hide their presence, and start internal spear phishing or interception of mails. The thing is that attackers have automated this. So the entire activity post the theft of credentials can take like 1 minute, 2 minutes, and so on. So it's typically outside of our human way or human capability to investigate. For example, at Conscia MDR, our median time to investigate is 4.5 minutes, which is really good, but it's not enough to address automated attacks. So if the attacker is able to use the compromised credentials within a minute or so, we need a faster way. So for that reason, for example, we have developed our own automations, which basically act faster than humans would act. So whenever, for example, we see a shady login, which has all the indications of AITM, we immediately log out the user. We have a custom automations in place, which basically brings the SOC closer to real-time prevention. So we are no longer detecting, analyzing, and then responding, but we have certain use cases which require fully automatic response. And for those cases, which are typically AITM, because they're heavily automated, we actually need to have a completely automatic system in place, which is also kind of soft, because if you log the user out, you are typically logging the attacker out. In the perhaps 1% of false positives, the user will simply have to relog in. So even if there is a false positive occasionally, it is not a problem. So that's a good example of, for example, how a SOC can actually develop their own automations when, for example, even XDR cannot act fast enough, or where humans interpreting XDR alerts cannot act fast enough. So the takeaways here is basically that MDR providers should today focus on the R. So if the provider is focusing on the D and leaving the R to you, you might be too late in your response. So definitely the recommendation is pre-authorize the MDR provider for response as much as you can. Always have exceptions in place, because obviously there are certain things which should not be responded on immediately, like things like servers, mission critical systems, and so on. Try to have a very nice, easy to use exception management system with a provider and lifecycle management system. So you're not doing this on a monthly basis, but you can actually change those policies on the fly, what can be responded to. And remember that human response today sometimes is too slow. For example, for AITM, we need to do better in terms of automatic response, bringing MDR provider very close to real-time response. So the classic preventive technology, but with the intelligence that the MDR provider is able to bring to the table. And if you're not doing this, little joke, right? For everything else, there is always incident response. So again, if you are too late in your responses, you will have to bring in the fire brigade, and things will get very, very expensive. You are basically not using the essence of MDR in that case. Good, so that's the second thing which is really important, is basically having the response element very strongly present in your MDR service, and especially again with the right speed. We have two more topics to go, which are a bit lighter. The first one is called reliance on magic. So first of all, vendors should not rely blindly on XDR technology. While XDR technology is great, it is not all powerful. It will have gaps, for example. There might be a black swan event when even XDR technology is not able to detect it. So what will you do when XDR fails? And when will you do it, right? So there are two kinds of black swan events. The first black swan event, which we have seen in the previous slides, when XDR is not fast enough, or when humans interpreting XDR are not fast enough. AITM is a classic example of advanced phishing attack, which can do that. And for that reason, we do black swan automations. We basically create custom automations which take the human out of the loop and only notify you and the customer afterwards that we have taken action automatically. The second thing is black swan false negatives like Log4j. Again, Log4j is an old story, I think still present in some environments, but it has been so popular in our minds that I think it's important to actually bring it up, because when Log4j came out, no XDR vendor had a satisfactory rule to detect that. So it was a blind spot. It was a false negative for everybody. Nobody could detect Log4j because it was an unusual way to trick software into doing something. And what happened at that point? So basically what we had to do as MDR providers is what basically was to create an emergency use case. So a detection use case to address that. For example, we have a policy that we have to create this in 24 hours. Should we wait for the vendors? My answer is no. Typically vendors take at least a week to create detection rules for completely new ways of system hacking or new techniques. So at least a week. Why? Because they have to design the rules so that they don't cause millions or billions of false positives. As vendors have a lot of customers, they will have always to create rules which are sensible for all environments. Your MDR provider, though, is dealing with a much lower number of customers, and your MDR provider has a much better chance of actually getting this rule out in 24 hours, and this should be a quality rule. When we talk about when we talk about emergency rules, I'm not talking about IOCs, hash or IP address based rules. Those rules are very simple to trick, not reliable. We are talking about behavioral or anomaly based rules which will catch variations of those attacks. And that's why those rules are difficult to write without a lot of false positives. So vendors which you rely on, technology vendors, will take some time, but the MDR vendor is much better positioned to create a strong behavior rule in a limited amount of time, because they will see how the rule reacts to your environment and they can tune it much easier than the vendor. So your MDR vendor should be able to respond to emergencies, and they should have a track record showing basically how they responded to previous emergencies when XDR had a gap in detection. So that's the first thing. So emergency use case creation is the first thing you should demand from the vendor. That could be an uncomfortable discussion for them. And the second thing for the vendor is we have to understand when a new issue comes out, when we learn about something like Log4j, that issue has not existed from today, but it has been present in our environments for months or years, right? When we find about new vulnerabilities, those are not new, right? They have been present in the code for years or months. So it is important for the vendor that basically whenever there is a new thing, they don't only look forward and create the detection rule for future events, they also do retro threat hunting for you. So you always ask them, do you also do retro threat hunting? Because this guarantees that they will be able to look in the past to see if this new vulnerability has actually been exploited in your environment while it was not being detected on. A very important thing. So both the future and the past have to be addressed by the vendors, which is rarely done by a lot of MDR vendors. So definitely MDR providers. So definitely ask them about this. The second reliance is not on technology, but on threat intelligence. So threat intelligence is basically today's education that we receive about what's happening in the world related to attacks, techniques, and so on. Marcus J. Radium, who is the father of firewalls, so a really renowned old school expert, basically in the 90s already he said, like, let's not enumerate badness. It is much better to enumerate the good stuff and alert on everything else. So he was advocating, obviously, the whitelisting model of security, which is, of course, today called zero trust. But even in the 90s, he was saying enumerating badness is a bad idea. So, antivirus, IPS signatures, and so on. Sometimes it is our only chance, right? But in general, we should be using stronger methods of detection and prevention. So threat intelligence, if it is being generated to be input into machines, if it is machine consumable threat intelligence, which is IOCs basically, so bad IP addresses, bad hashes, and so on, we need to be really aware that those things are limited in use, they don't address mutations of attacks, they might be only valid for a couple of hours, and so on. So we have to be acutely aware of IOC limitations, and IOCs should not be our primary way of detecting anything. IOCs should be our kind of last resort in detecting something, or a supplement on which to other things which are much stronger. So MDR provider which heavily relies on IOCs and threat intelligence is typically not able to detect a lot of things, especially not variations, especially not things which are longer term in their validity. So this is really important. So IOCs, again, are very limited in detection usefulness. They might be, for example, used for incident response. They might be used for attack attribution and so on. But for pure detection purposes, they should be considered a secondary means of detection. The second form of threat intelligence, which is not machine consumable, but human consumable, is, I think, more important. So as MDR providers, we learn about new techniques, about new things in the wild, and that allows us to create new use cases. So that's goodness, right? So ask your MDR provider how they use human consumable threat intelligence. Do they use it to create new use cases? Do they use it to train their analysts and so on? So that's the good side, the light side of threat intelligence, basically learning about things and not relying on the machine consumable parts too much. Okay, so that's really important. For example, at Conscia MDR, we use this to create our own emergency use cases if needed, if XDR does not cover that. But we also use this to educate customers about what is about to happen to them or what strategically they should think about based on knowledge of what criminal groups are doing. And lastly, reliance on AI, right? So there is no SOC out there or no MDR provider which doesn't claim that AI is really an integral part of their operations. I typically don't believe them. Why is AI important for us as MDR providers? Because it kind of hints at what we want to do in a couple of years, which is automatic closing of cases based on AI triage. We are not there yet. Today, AI is really successful as generative AI. So it means it generates stuff. And if it generates stuff, it is much more useful to attackers today. It generates phishing mails, it generates phishing sites, it generates malware and so on. But as MDR providers, we cannot fully leverage AI today for what we want most, which is basically reliable triage of cases, right? Fast and reliable triage. We cannot do it yet. So typically attackers are using it, and we're using automation to fight it. So with automation, we can find the additional scalability which attackers will have based on AI. But I think the use of AI in the SOC is typically really, really overstated. We might use it as, co-pilots, assistants, summarizers, and so on to slightly improve our investigation times. but it is nowhere near the ability to actually fully take over the human element of the MDR service. So challenge your providers about specifics, how they're using AI, and very likely what you're about to learn is that they will say, well, we use machine learning. And machine learning has been there for 10 or 15 years, and all the XDR products actually use machine learning since forever, right? So machine learning is a great tool for us to do anomaly-based detection, but what we want to do is actually triage afterwards, right? And this is something where AI is not there yet. Okay, so how do we rely on magic? So we shouldn't rely on magic, because we should always take XDR platforms, as good as they are, as also fallible. They might have gaps, and MDR providers should be able to address those gaps when those gaps happen. They typically happen like once or twice per year, that we have a new class of attack which is not immediately addressable through XDR. But still, XDR is by far the most effective detection platform. The second thing is always understand that machine consumable threat intel, so IOCs, should not be a primary detection mechanism unless you have no other choice. And lastly, machine consumable TI is really good if you want to do decision making based on it or development of use cases, but that's basically the MDR provider's job. And understand that AI, again, typically means machine learning in most MDR providers, which is nothing too fancy. And our last topic will be workload management. So this is a typical fear of customers. I'm being onboarded to an MDR service. What will be the workload demanded of us, the customers, when we work with the MDR service? So what will the provider do when they have to talk to us? How often? When will this happen? So this is a typical fear of the customer, and the question will be basically, how much time do I need to spend working with an external MDR service? And I will give you a typical consultant's answer. It depends. The thing is that we have to basically see what are the factors which basically are like pros and cons in terms of high or low workload for the customer. And the spectrum of options is pretty wide. So in the best case scenario, what you want ideally the MDR provider to do is not bother you at all. Basically, the MDR provider is receiving the alerts, the telemetry, and they're doing all investigations completely independently, autonomously, without your help. On the other end of the spectrum, the MDR provider is not doing a lot of triage. They're simply forwarding the alerts to you and asking you to explain them, basically that you perform their job. So this is kind of the spectrum of things. The truth is somewhere in the middle, and mostly the truth is somewhere on the left, towards the left side, hopefully, if it's a good MDR provider. So every single MDR provider will run into cases when they cannot complete the investigation to its end without some business knowledge from your side. But that should be limited. So basically they should have basically a very low rate of questions, low rate of interactions towards you when they actually don't know something. And especially with the XDR technology underlying today's MDR services, this is typically much easier to do, because XDR technology allows providers to actually be much more autonomous because they have much more telemetry available for root cause analysis. So the choice of technology will heavily influence where you are in this spectrum. So users with XDR technology will be much more to the left side. Users with CM technology will be much more to the right-hand side, which kind of is another nail in the coffin for CM technology. Now, the factors influencing the best case scenario. So typically, you will see very little interaction with your MDR service operationally on a daily basis if your platforms are rather generic, which means that you're not using too exotic things. You're not using things which heavily depend on business specifics. And that is typically most of the IT platforms. So most of the IT platforms which are based on Windows, Linux, Mac OS, classic cloud, SaaS, Office, Azure, GCP, AWS, that typically is considered generic today. So in those environments, the providers have the knowledge and have the telemetry where they can complete most investigations autonomously. The second thing is, they need to have the right tools. If they have XDR, they are typically much easier to actually arrive at the root cause in the root cause analysis process. If you're orderly, that also helps, right? So if you're orderly, meaning that your users are typically not having like all the freedoms in the world for executing software, downloading software, and so on. So the more orderly you are, the less interaction you will have with the MDR provider. And lastly, if there is an interaction, the provider should have tools which make this interaction very simple. So for example, what we do with Conscia SOC is we have a portal. If we have a question for you, we simply ask you a yes or no question on the portal about a particular scenario which we have seen. And we're also coming now with a mobile app, which will make basically those questions answerable, like answering a phone call. So we should basically, typically we claim that with our typical customers, the total time which you spend with us on a monthly basis for all of your human resources is about 2 hours. So very, very lightweight. On the other end, worst case scenario, we are investigating an extremely business specific platform like an OT environment or a custom application, things which are not standardized. And for that reason, the analysts in the MDR and in the MDR provider would need to know basically how everything works and so on. And this is not really scalable for MDR providers. So in a lot of those cases, MDR providers will simply forward the alert to you and they will say, this seems dangerous. What do you think? So this is really important. The second thing, if the MDR provider is relying heavily on CMs typically have way less data for root cause analysis, and typically providers sooner run into the obstacle and forward the question to you saying, what do you think, right? And then you are doing the investigation instead of the MDR provider. If your environment is chaotic, especially for execution, or if you are very dynamic in terms of travel, there will be a lot of questions about users traveling to Nigeria or to Vietnam and so on. Is it a business trip or is it vacation? Because a lot of the cloud attacks will happen based on unusual logins, and that basically has to overlaps with travel quite a bit. And lastly, if the provider is working with you, always check the tools they're using. If they're using email for asking you questions, that's probably not a good idea because this is sensitive data, and email is definitely not the most secure platform to discuss sensitive data on. So key takeaways: ensure that when you're going for an MDR service, that you will have basically a low workload with the MDR provider having really good tools, really good technology, and generally investigating things which are more or less standard most of the time. You also have to accept the fact that, again, MDR providers will not be able to learn about the specifics of your OT environment to a large degree, not being able to learn about how your custom application works because it is not scalable for them. If they're willing to accept this, it will be very, very expensive. So sometimes we even say to customers, if you have extremely domain-specific stuff, perhaps it's best to do this yourself in-house and let all the rest be handled by the MDR provider, because you know your business best. And if you have business-specific detections, they're typically late in the attack chain, so they're not as time-pressing as the classic initial access incidents. So it makes sense sometimes to split the detection framework and basically say all the criminal stuff, which leads almost to impact, will be led by an external MDR provider, while some business-specific stuff, fraud detection and so on, will still be handled in-house because they're not as time-critical as the initial access and lateration incidents. And the good news is also that if you feel that you're not orderly, MDR can make you orderly, because a good MDR provider will, based on what they have seen, issue recommendations to you and basically advise you on how to get more orderly based on hard evidence. I think this is also something which MDR providers should provide, and you should demand this as part of your MDR service, that basically you're getting maturity increasing recommendations all the time. So that brings us to the end, the 4 areas in which we feel that MDR providers should be challenged on: threat visibility, the ability to respond quickly and reliably, not relying on magic, and ensuring a low and consistent workload from your side. Now, I will look at the questions which you might have, and we can discuss things time permitting. Okay, let me check the questions. Just pose your questions in chat or Q&A, and I will answer them immediately. Okay, I will just wait a couple of seconds because we don't have a lot of questions. This actually means that I might have actually spoken about most of the things. Yeah, thank you, Sasha, for encouraging comments. Cool. If you have any questions, feel free to also contact me. My name is Jan Bervar, so it's jbervar@conscia.com. And I will definitely address your questions in email, because I think this is a very, very interesting and complex topic. And as I said, I have been working in this field for 30 years plus, and I'm working in MDR because I feel this is the place where we can make the most difference today. So as there are no specific questions, I would like to thank you very much for attending the webinar. If you have further questions, either contact me or your local Conscia representative if you want to learn more about our own MDR services. Thank you very much.